Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you online today to EPA Victoria's 9th Environmental Seminar Series on Sound Thinking for a Quieter Environment, Managing Noise Around Us, with our special guest speaker, Marion Burgess from the University of New South Wales. I'm Dr. Andrea Hinwood. I'm Victoria's Chief Environmental Scientist at EPA Victoria. Before we do much more, I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today and pay my respects to the elders past and present. And I extend my respect to the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people, colleagues, staff and students who might be listening today. Given we're meeting from all over the globe, I'd also like to acknowledge our First Nations people everywhere and thank each of you for giving your time to come and listen to this event on noise. Just a few notes on this live stream event. I personally am having some internet issues, and in fact, I can hear a little bit of feedback while I'm speaking, which I hope you can't. I'm also seeing a hazard light come up on my system. So please be patient with any technical issues that we might be having. This is only our second time holding this series in this format, so I'm hoping we'll be able to resolve any bugs. The structure of today's event will feature an introduction by myself and then a presentation by Marion Burgess, with some time for questions and answers after that. The event will be recorded live, so if you need to leave early or miss parts, you can watch it again later via EPA's website. We also have live closed captions to make sure it's accessible for all. We should be putting a link to that in a Q&A button. So if you have a look at the bar on your screen, you should see a little icon with some question marks. That's the Q&A. That's also where you put your questions in, but it's where you can access that live captions facility. We will open the question and answer session now, but we'll respond to questions after the presentations, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. If we can't get to all of them, we'll respond via email at a later time. So if you can provide your contact details, that would be useful so we can get back to you on those matters. So today we're here to discuss sound thinking for a quieter environment, managing the noise around us. It's a topic that's important to EPA Victoria, and clearly by the very large number of registrations we have to this event from a range of locations, it's obviously a topic that many people are also equally interested in. Our world is full of sound. At the moment, I'm sitting inside with the wind raging around my home, and I can hear it quite loudly, and I hope you can't. When noise is, or sound is loud and intrusive, we refer to it as noise, and in an urban environment, noise pollution can come from many sources. It can come from our neighbours, commercial, industrial sites, construction sites, roadworks, and transport, of course. And we, the EPA Victoria, receive many complaints every year from the public about noisy neighbours, vehicles, venues, and of course noise from industry and construction. Residential noise is one of the most common sources of noise for Victorians, and it can also be the most annoying. And that is noise that comes from a residential property and what's around it. And it can come from stereos or radios. Some of you may not like my opera playing on a Sunday morning, televisions, air conditioners, lawnmowers, and power tools that people use around their home. And of course, construction activities create a lot of noise while people are renovating homes and apartments. Perhaps it's not surprising that we have recorded a major increase in noise pollution in the first 6 months of this year because of the restrictions associated with coronavirus. And about half of all noise pollution calls to EPA were about residential noise. And for those of us living with either stage 3 or 4 restrictions, you may have noticed that yourself because you're home more. Some stats for you. We saw or have seen a 45% overall increase in low-level noise reports in comparison to last year. Noise pollution reports doubled from February to March, reaching their highest in July at 548 reports. Noise queries, as distinct from pollution reports, which includes questions about noise limits or legislation, they also increased this year in May with 432 queries. Almost half of inquiries were about residential noise, including loud music, traffic, and low-level construction. We're all spending more time at home. It's a fact of life that we all make noise in some way, and what's enjoyable to some people will certainly be annoying to another. And although noise is inevitable, and we accept that to an extent, managing noise is also really important because noise does have impacts on human health. And so it's really important that we consider it in terms of people's health and well-being. We know that ongoing exposure to noise can lead to a wide range of issues such as headaches, increased blood pressure, fatigue, irritability, poor reading comprehension and attention in children. And of course, if noise is really loud, we know that it can cause hearing damage. There are a wide variety of studies that have been conducted on the health effects of noise. There's a strong relationship between high noise levels and cardiovascular disease. I think most of us know about sleep disruption, and of course that in itself can have a range of problems which affect behaviour and performance and can have other health consequences. Chronic exposure to transport noise has been reported to be associated with elevated blood pressure, but also cardiovascular disease and specific events. And it's also been associated with an increase in accidents. There are many people in our community who are more vulnerable to the effects of noise, such as the sick, elderly and young, and those with chronic health issues, but also our shift workers. And let's not forget our fauna, our native fauna in particular. Noise can also have impacts on non-living materials as well, such as when old places or newly constructed buildings have developed cracks when there's a stress of explosive sound. EPA, Victoria Police, local government and other government agencies all share responsibility in this space, so it can be a little confusing at times. Under the Environment Protection Act, EPA has an important role in protecting the community from noise pollution. And we have a framework for control of noise from residential premises, and we have state environment protection policies that are focused on assessing the impact of noise on the environment, but also with some tools to help us deal with it. And it's probably worth saying that our role is really about unreasonable noise. We have specialists in noise and acoustic science. We have environment protection officers and officers for the protection of the local environment who respond to noise pollution events. And our staff actually conduct, over 100 assessments each year. And in particular, our officers for protection of the local environment in local government, they're embedded in local government. They undertake more than 150 noise assessments a year. And of course, when noise is found to be unreasonable from particularly industrial sources, we issue pollution abatement notices. So we work with and provide advice and guidance to government and industry to minimise noise from projects. And we have a range of guidelines and information to help explain what noise might be unreasonable and how to assess it. And of course, any noise from a residence can be unreasonable at any time of the day, depending on, how loud it is, its intensity, the type of noise, what the sound is actually like, and how close people are, and how long it continues for. But there's an awful lot that can be done to prevent these issues, which is why we talk about them in these types of seminars, so that we can reduce the negative effects of noise. For example, we do have regulations that we can actually apply to restrict noise. There are always the use of engineering noise control options for a range of different devices. Traffic management strategies can decrease noise, and of course, public awareness about noise issues more generally. So on this note, we're here today to talk with us today about this important area is our guest speaker, Ms Marion Burgess. Marion is an acoustics researcher at the University of New South Wales, and for over 40 years she has primarily worked in noise, including building, environmental, occupational noise measurement, assessments, control and research, and she's got a diverse experience across teaching, research and consulting. Since retiring in 2017, Marion has continued an active involvement in an honorary position at the University of New South Wales, and she was awarded the Order of Australia in 2015 for significant service to science in the field of acoustics, particularly noise management, and to professional scientific organisations. She's published widely, and she regularly participates in national and international acoustics meetings and is currently chief editor of the journal Acoustics Australia. She is the past president of the International Institute of Noise Control Engineering and a previous president of the International Commission for Acoustics. She's been involved from the outset in the International Commission for Acoustics goal for an International Year of Sound, which happened to be 2020. However, this has been scheduled now for 2021. So clearly, Marion is absolutely a wealth of experience and knowledge, and who will be able to assist us in talking about these issues today. And I'm sure you'll be joining me virtually in welcoming Marion today. Please, Marion, take it away.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for a very nice introduction there, and thank you for your kind words. In this presentation today, my goal is to talk about a lot of the aspects of sound, and many of those you've already mentioned, and I'll hopefully be picking them up as we go through the presentation. So if I can have the next slide, please. All right, so sound. What is sound? Sound is all around us, and it's actually fundamental to our social structure. Just imagine how boring life would be if we could hear nothing. You know, we would go out walking and there would be no sound of the wind rustling in the trees. There'd be no sound of the birds in the trees and everything like that. So sound is part of our social structure. There are some very basic requirements for sound. It's a safety, warning of danger, and also, of course, communication. And also there's other aspects to sound, and that's cultural expression, spiritual expression, celebration, recreation, etc. So we have a very important range of activities associated with sound. Next slide, please. So what is our goal? We really want to keep sound in its most desirable form. We want to be able to keep it so that it sounds good to us, so that we like the sound. In that manner, we need to control sound within spaces to ensure that the sound gives enjoyment, but also then minimises the sound that's going outside that space into the surrounding areas. If you look on the side of this, we have a picture of the Philharmonie in Paris, you know, a very wonderful music hall, quite recent, quite innovative design, wonderful sound inside it. And then we have the other picture there, which is of an outdoor sound concert with all of the lights, and you can imagine all the sound going up into the sky. So the control of sound from a wide range of the activities of our life becomes quite difficult to control, but we do have ways and means of doing that. Next slide, please. So if I just go back a little bit, sound and human settlement. It's an outcome, as I just said, of the functions of society. We need to have industry, we need to have commerce, we need to have transportation, and with all of that comes sound. So at some time, everyone who lives in the community has been exposed to sound that's generated by others. And, you know, once that sound reaches a level where it annoys or disturbs us, that's when it's no longer considered as being acceptable, and that's when we refer to it as noise. So that's the changeover point between sound and noise. Noise is basically that we don't want to hear, because there's so much sound that we actually do want to hear. Next slide, please. To try and just give a little very simple quantitative measure for sound, this thermometer style shows that, you know, we're talking about sound as we're measuring it in the environment, down to as low as 10. We're very unlikely to ever get down to as low as 10 dB. Falling leaves are generally about 20 dB. The slightest bit of wind or atmospherics around, you're very unlikely to get anything below 25 dB or 30 dB. 30 dB to 50, 60 is kind of the sorts of range of noise levels that we are likely to experience in our house. It can be a little bit louder in the office, where we've got office machinery and other actions being taken by other people in the office environment. That's when we eventually get back to our offices, of course. Inside a car, this is actually showing it at 90. Well, actually inside a car is lower than that, but then what happens is that people turn up their sound systems inside the car. So it ends up being around about that 80-ish. I think that particular spot there is a little bit higher. There's been a lot of work done on reducing the the interior noise inside motor vehicles. The stereo music there around about 100, that's kind of where, if you go to a club or a pub or a venue where you've got some live music, generally it's running at around about 95 to 100, unless it's considered as background noise, in which case it'd be much lower. And then we get into the area of industrial noise and the noise from individual tools, etc. I'll just give a couple of points here, and one is that around about 60 dBA is the sound of a voice if you're speaking to somebody at about a metre. So if the external noise is around about 60, 65, you can still communicate very well. If the external noise is getting up to 80 or 90, that's when you're having to really raise your voice to speak in that environment. Next slide, please. So if I talk about the upper limits for sound, in that we are very concerned about ensuring that people in the workplace don't suffer from hearing damage from their exposure to sound. So the hearing damage can be measured and can be quantified. So we can have audiometric checks, and the audiologist can identify if and whether there is a loss in our perception of ability to hear sound. Therefore, there are workplace practice limits, and these are embedded in national and international legislation in Australia. And in Australia, this is that the equivalent energy level, that's what this LAEQ, 8 hours, so that's the average level, effectively, it's the average level over 8 hours, should not exceed 85 dB. And at any one time, a peak level, that's like, say, something from an explosive shot or something that has a very powerful but very short duration pulse, shouldn't exceed 140 dBc. So that 85 dBA, I'll talk mainly about that, that's kind of the level, if you're exposed to 85 dBA for a period of 8 hours, then that's considered to be excess noise in the working environment. Now, you can be exposed to higher than 85 dBA, but for shorter periods of time. It's an averaging process. So what happens if the noise in a workplace is above 85 dBA, averaged out over 8 hours? Then we try to do the best we can in terms of implementing engineering controls at source or between the source and where the worker is, or using personal hearing protection as a last resort. And you'll see on construction sites where there are a lot of very noisy equipment, it's also somewhat unpredictable about when the equipment's going to be turning on and off. You'll see that wearing of personal hearing protection is one of the obligations for people who are in that environment, or in that workplace, I should say. So we have a very wide range of engineering options for reducing noise at source. And there's a lot of improved design with modern products, and we've also got a great benefit from lightweight materials, carbon fibre materials. So where we used to rely very much on mass and big heavy enclosures, we've now got a lot more interesting and innovative techniques. Other factors that are really helping in terms of improving the control of noise at the source is the development of computational techniques that give us a better understanding of the energy flow, and also give opportunity for model testing before production. In terms of the energy flow, some of those images, the image on the far right-hand side there is representing how the sound is actually distributing around that particular source. So these are all aids that really help noise control engineers to implement improved noise control options. If I can have the next slide, please. For difficult problems, we need new approaches, and as well as dealing with actually at the source itself and looking at the energy flow, there's the development of completely new ways of doing things. You know, look at it and think, well, okay, maybe there's a better way of doing this now, which is not going to produce so much noise. Some of the other techniques involve clever materials, and one of them is micro-perforated panels are offering opportunities for noise control. Sonic crystals, sounds very gee whiz stuff, but that's absorbing particularly very high absorption at particular frequencies. Metamaterials, and these are curious materials that are neither metamaterial and they're not material. Very, very interesting materials, and we're really still at the outset of applying those in acoustic environments. And there's another emerging area, which is acoustic black holes. We all know about black holes out in astronomy. In the case of acoustic black holes, it's a very trendy name to be given to something, but essentially you design the material so that the energy in the vibration sort of disappears to essentially nothing at a particular point, but that involves tapering all of the metal surfaces down, or the beams down, to a very narrow point. So it is still a bit challenging, but there are very interesting laboratory experiments showing, and it often doesn't take very long between a laboratory experiment or a research project before that it actually becomes then effectively useful in the real world, in application, when industries pick up those techniques. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's really looking at noise at the source. Now, if we think about the sound in the environment, one of the big challenges that we have with sound in the environment and establishing reasonable limits to the noise is that there's a huge variation in individual response. I mentioned that in the workplace environment, we can quantify the noise. We can quantify the noise from demographic studies. We can say, well, if we can keep the noise below 85 dBA averaged over 8 hours, the majority of the population will not show any adverse effects on their hearing. For the environment, we have a much greater challenge because it's difficult to actually measure it. We need to consider aspects like health effects, and substantially the reaction to noise in our environment is related to annoyance. As I said before, when a sound becomes annoying, that's when we refer to it as noise, and that's what the challenge for the environmental agencies around the world, not just in Victoria, but around the world, is to balance the need to do things in the environment with the fact of trying to minimise the amount of annoyance for the residents who are in that area. If I can have the next slide, please. So let's think about noise from community activities. This has been part of community life since the time of settlement. Initially, the noise was generated by the activities of tradespeople. There's historic reports where, around the Middle Ages and earlier, certain trades like stone chippers and those sorts of known to be very noisy trades had to actually move outside the city limits because they caused so much annoyance to the people inside the cities. Transportation, back in Roman days, they were complaining about the sound of wagon wheels on the stone roads and the cobbled roads, and there were even limits for the hours that wagons could enter into the city so that they wouldn't disturb the residents of the city. The noise from community activities has increased dramatically with the Industrial Revolution. That introduced mechanical machinery, which had the power to make a lot of noise. And then as well, we have powered transportation. Next slide, please. So, as I say, historically, the control measures were very similar to what we would do today. And if I just take the example of the road traffic noise, the wagons were banned from the city streets at night. So that was limited by time of day. Then they tried to reduce the noise from the surface by putting straw or dirt added to the road in an attempt to achieve quieter road surfaces. In more recent centuries, the type of road surface was looked at, and even to the point of replacing cobblestones with wooden blocks, which were shown to not radiate as much noise when the vehicles were passing over them. Also, if you look at from the planning point of view, the older cities were designed such that the higher quality housing was located at greater distance from the roads, and it's certainly a greater distance from where the potentially noisy activities of the work were taking place. Next slide, please. So while annoying noise is more extensive in the cities and affects a greater number of people due to the population density, But it also occurs in the rural areas and on the urban fringe as an outcome of increased farming mechanisation. And particularly nowadays, because the machinery that is used is quite powerful, because it's meant to do a lot of tasks as quickly and as efficiently as possible. But also the focus on the design of this equipment has been on the efficiency of its operation. So it's difficult for the farmer, while there are improvements being made all the time in terms of the design. So the latest version of a particular farming machine may well be quieter than the older one, but it's very difficult for the farmers to justify the high cost of continuing to update their machinery, mainly because they might only use it for a certain part of the time of the year. As well as that, we've got the other innovations in the rural industries, like on the image on the bottom right-hand side there with crop dusting. So that then brings the noise of the aircraft down very, very low over the farming areas. Next slide, please. So the steps for managing noise in the community, basically it comes down to first identifying and acknowledging the problem. Then you need to establish a noise policy framework to be able to manage this problem. And within this noise policy framework, you have to establish some noise limits. And of course, I've just said before, that's probably the hardest thing to do, because we're really only working on annoyance reactions from the community, plus the more recent information on health effects. So the combination of those two aspects. And then once you've done that, then we have to monitor and assess compliance as part of the enforcement process, because it's all very well to give a permission for a particular activity to take place and that the noise levels are not supposed to exceed a certain value at the nearest residential property. But it's very important that that is monitored and checked, and making sure that those compliance levels are complied with. Next slide, please. So the concerns about noise in Australia, it's not a new problem. I'll just do a little diversion here. I'm very grateful for my colleague in Argentina, as a chance meeting at a conference, then led on to a bit of a discussion about things. And he's an acoustic historian, and he's been spending his time during his enforced restriction in Argentina to delve into the various libraries around the world that he's been able to access. And he's pulled up an amazing amount of information about the reactions to community noise and the actions taken about community noise in Australia. So I'm very indebted to him for the information that's on the next couple of slides. And he found out that there was a Noise Abatement League in Melbourne and a Noise Abatement Society in Sydney, both founded back in 1928. And the people who founded these organisations were senior leaders of society, and they urged actions to reduce noise. Their comments are very, very outstanding comments. Noise is a nerve poison, unhealthy, unpleasant, and irritating. There's no need for excessive noise, which is made by the minority to hurt and the harm of every one of the majority of the community. Next slide, please. And here we have some other comments that were made. Now, most of these recorded comments from the leagues are based on newspaper reports, which were very, very particular and were urging people to go along to go to various meetings. So the outcome of these meetings were that they needed to have numerous letters from working women who claim that their sleep and that of their children is continuously broken at night by the hooting and roaring of motorcycles and motor cars. And if you think about it, this is back in the 1920s, so there weren't that many motorcycles and motor cars in the area. They urged the head teachers of schools to address their pupils on the subject and influence of noise on health. And here they were identifying already the potential for damage from noise on health. And they even began to talk about legal control of noise on various activities because it was dangerous and injurious to health and should be considered a nuisance within the meaning of the Public Health Act. So these leagues had a number of medical people in them, and they were really being driven very much by public health, of their perception at that time that it was important to control noise for the benefit of public health. Next slide, please. Now, they even undertook some measurements, and the image on the left-hand side there is some measurements being made in Melbourne back in around about 1930s. And, you know, we might think it's a bit challenging at the moment to undertake measurements, and we've got a handheld sound level meter. I used to think it was difficult when I had to cart a tape recorder around as well, but having to have all of that equipment in order to make some measurements, I really admire their efforts. And they demonstrated there the noise of individual vehicles going past, showing the noise levels. I'm not convinced that their actual absolute values are correct, but certainly the relative value showing how it's generally quiet, and then you're suddenly getting these short, very high noise levels, which definitely is one of the aspects of increasing annoyance. Next slide, please. These show some measurements in the 1950s when it was more feasible to have more portable equipment, but even still it was very clunky, and you can see the small microphone there, and the one on the right is trying to measure the noise from a refrigerator. So there were a lot of efforts in the 1950s once the instrumentation began to become more portable. And that has some significance because it's really in the 1960s, 70s, and then in the latter part of the 1900s that the policy frameworks and the acceptable noise levels or the noise limits were established. If I can have the next slide, please. So the development of policy framework really only started, as far as we can find out from research at this stage, the very first zoning noise ordinance that actually specified maximum noise levels was back in 1957. But even then it was a little bit of a notional ordinance in that it was difficult to apply due to the limited capacity for undertaking the measurements. And so we jump forward into the 1960s, like 1968, Japan is believed to be the first country to introduce noise provisions in legislation. But those noise provisions were limited to workplace and construction noise at that time. In the 1970s, again, it was associated with the development of more portable instrumentation and more accurate ways and standards in terms of calibration, etc. And in the 1970s, there was a big move to protect all aspects of the environment, and most countries around the world established some form of environmental legislation in the 1970s, and that included aspects associated with noise. Next slide, please. So in Australia in the 1970s, each state developed its own policy. Harmonisation was encouraged at the federal level, but for various reasons, each state had slightly different approaches, and that still remains the case. However, the common feature is that they're all based on the dBA, and that's a number that'll come up a number of times in the future, but to define that the A is a filter that is incorporated into the sound level meter that has a similar frequency response to the human ear. So we can construct a sound level meter which has a very flat frequency response, but that's not the way our human ear hears the sound. So the A weighting is a filter that's put into the measurement chain to ensure that the numbers that we get out of the measurement process are somewhat similar to and relevant to the way we're hearing sound. Next slide, please. So if we then move on into the 1990s, nationally and internationally, environmental management began to move to focus more on the natural environment. Clean air, clean water, ensuring biodiversity. And in part this was because it was well understood that bad air and bad water would lead to health effects. But environmental noise was considered only to be annoyance. So we had the noise control in the workplace, which was to protect against damaging noise, but the management of environmental noise began to become very much lower down the priority chain, because the focus was on making sure that the air and the water were kept nice and clean, because it was well known that they would lead to health effects. So it was acknowledged that there was a need to quantify health effects from noise below the hearing damage level. And this is the point where the World Health Organization actually began to become involved in sponsoring and supporting various investigations. Next slide, please. And the first document that they came out with, which was summarising the health effects of noise, was back in 1999, and it was the World Health Organization Guidelines for Community Noise. And they identified right up there in the introductory sections that they considered the potential health effects of community noise includes these effects on hearing, sleep disturbance, cardiovascular effects, performance reduction and annoyance responses. I've highlighted in red there the cardiovascular effects, because that will keep coming up again in terms of the health effects of noise, the outcome of studies on the health effects of noise. It's important to understand that these studies were mainly undertaken by countries within the European Union. And in order to undertake studies on measuring health effects, you have to have large cohort groups that are exposed to much the same noise to see whether or not there really is effect of the noise. So there is somewhat of a bias in all of these studies to those people that are living in more highly populated cities, because that was really where many of these studies were undertaken. Not all, but many of them. Next slide, please. So having achieved that outcome, that report, the European Union became very active in this space, and they introduced a directive in 2002, and this is associated with environmental noise, and they're saying it's part of the community policy to achieve a high level of health and environmental protection, and one of the objectives is to be protection against noise, and they refer to some of their earlier documentation. And they actually said it's one of the main environmental problems in Europe. So this really gave a big impetus for yet more studies on really delving into the health effects of noise and providing good guidance, improved guidance on what would be acceptable noise levels for noise in the environmental and community areas. The significance of the EU directive is that this was a directive to all the member countries of the EU that they needed to do something about this. One of the requirements was they had to do maps, noise maps around cities. And while the noise maps are really just monitoring the existing noise, it's putting a focus on the importance of noise and assisting a broad range of specialists, including the planners, and really reinforcing the importance of the noise, the fact that we can measure it, that it varies from one part of a city to another. And, we need to really consider this in terms of planning objectives, as well as environmental noise policies. Next slide, please. So just talking a little bit more about the health effects of noise. As I mentioned, the evidence of health effects is mainly from European studies. There were major multi-country studies supported by the European Union. So a lot of these studies were done there were some done in the 1990s, but there have been a lot more over the last 2 decades of this century. There's similar concerns around the rest of the world, but it's really been the impetus of the WHO and the EU that has really kept this going, because other studies around the world are there, but they're being done by individual agencies, and it's really hard. It's really important that the EU has had such an important role in the WHO to bring all of these different studies together and analyse them and come up with some recommendations. Next slide, please. So we have in 2009 the WHO guidelines were introduced for night noise guidelines for Europe. Now, at this point, they really acknowledged the fact that the data they had was really relevant to Europe. So they specified that these guidelines were applicable to Europe. And they've got these levels here in terms of a target noise level and an interim target, acknowledging that it's going to be really hard to have an average noise level over the nighttime period of 40 dB. But they thought that it was reasonable to have as an interim target one of 55 dB over the nighttime. Next slide, please. Then we come up to the WHO burden of disease. This was another report trying to identify, well, okay, if there are these health effects, cardiovascular effects, etc., how are these affecting the lifespan of people, or are these affecting the lifespan of people? And so one of the studies was the disability adjusted life years. And this study indicates that the number of years lost for environmental noise in Western European countries, and you can see those numbers there, they're really amazing, like 61,000 for heart disease, 45,000 cognitive impairment of children, 903,000 for sleep disturbance, etc. So these are really sort of emphasising the fact that we do need to be very careful about noise in the community, because noise has these health effects. If it affects the health, then it affects the healthy lifestyle as well. Next slide, please. So then there was another, because there'd been quite a few studies done in the 3 decades from the 1990s, 2000, 2010, there was a major evaluation of health effects, and this involved a review of major studies to try and actually look across all the different studies that had been undertaken, try and evaluate the strengths of the outcomes from the different studies. Some studies were made on very small groups, other studies were made on very, very large groups. So trying to pull all of this together in a meta-analysis of all the findings. And that then led to some further guidelines that were released by the WHO on the different types of environmental noise sources, and then linking that across to the likely health effects from the evidence of all of this big meta-analysis of all these different studies that had been undertaken. Next slide, please. And that led in 2018 to the WHO Environmental Noise Guidelines for Europe. So these are based on the LDEN. Now I need to explain that. That's a day, evening and night averaged value. So it doesn't mean that road traffic noise should not exceed 53 dBA. You can have it a bit higher during the day and then a bit lower in the evening, and then it'll go lower at the end of the very late at night when the traffic. So it's kind of averaging it out over the entire period. As well as that, they have an L nighttime value that would just apply the average value over the nighttime. So I do emphasise again that these numbers don't mean that the noise level should not exceed that number at any time during the day. It's an averaged value. So their recommendations range from a 53 dBA over the 24-hour period, the day, evening and night, down to, for road traffic noise, down to 45 dBA associated with aircraft noise. And similarly, the nighttime values are lower than the average ones over the entire day. They also put one in for wind turbine noise, and because that was so low at 45 dBA, they didn't put another one in for nighttime. Next slide, please. So what were the main health effects that they indicated if the noise levels were much above those values that they were giving as guidelines? And you'll see that heart disease comes up on most of these. Ischemic heart disease, annoyance, sleep disturbance, potential incidence of stroke and diabetes, and were all indicated from studies associated with road traffic noise. Railway noise was predominantly annoyance and sleep disturbance. Aircraft noise was the annoyance. There was some concern about reading and oral comprehension. Sleep disturbance, and this one I think is interesting, potentially change in waist circumference. I don't quite understand that one, but anyway, unless the people just felt that they didn't want to go out walking and exercising because of the concern about overflying aircraft. However, that one popped up as a reasonably good evidence for that particular outcome, health effect from people who are exposed to aircraft noise. And with wind turbine, the only findings they had were related to annoyance. Next slide, please. Leisure noise they dealt with in a slightly different way, and they really based that one on the effects of hearing damage, primarily because it's well known that there are a lot of leisure noises that are very loud, that are well above 85 dB, well above workplace noise limits, well above the limits that if their people are exposed to them for long periods of time, they would be likely to have some form of hearing damage. The problem with this one is you're trying to look at a yearly average, so it's not just a daily average that I've been talking about, it's a yearly average of 70. So it's a very difficult one to deal with, and it's probably better for the WHO is now continuing to work with an app to indicate music noise exposure, which will be a much better way of dealing with it than having a single number guideline. But the main message from this is that leisure noise, even though you might want to, you're enjoying the leisure and you might want to be active in it, that can still have the same effect on your hearing, and it still needs control, just like any other aspect of noise. Next slide, please. Around about the time the WHO were doing this review of all the different studies, NHealth in Australia was also undertaking a study where they were actually reviewing a whole lot of major studies, as I said, very similar to the WHO. And from looking at these studies, as completely independent of the WHO review, they found, again, there was sufficient evidence for environmental noise and sleep disturbance and cardiovascular disease, and that there should be health-based limits for residential lands. And the recommendations were not that dissimilar, slightly different metrics. So they're looking at equivalent energy just over the nighttime and then the daytime one. So slightly different metrics. And that's one of the confusing things with a lot of the environmental noise limits is different jurisdictions use different metrics. But in most cases, they all come in very similar to each other if you do the adjustments to allow for this metric versus another metric. Next slide, please. Okay, so assessing the noise. As I mentioned a while ago, it's essential to monitor the noise to ensure compliance. There have been great advances in technical aspects of noise measurement. The days of having to carry a heavy tape recorder around, like that person there on the left-hand side, have well and truly gone, and we have handheld sound level meters that have got the capacity of what used to be big laboratory-based instrumentation. We've also got loggers that can be left out on site for long periods of time and therefore monitor the noise over weeks or months. We also have more complicated arrays that can assist with identifying the direction of noise, because simple monitors will just pick up all the noise in the area, and there are many circumstances where it's important to know from which direction the noise is predominantly coming, so that the noise control measures can be applied in that direction. Next slide, please. So as I said, even a basic sound level meter has the processing and storage capacity to provide a wide range of metrics. Additional features such as audio file storage and transmission back to base for remote monitoring really assist. You don't really need to have the storage on location. You can just have a sensor on location and transmit the data to the cloud for storage. And this is opening up a lot of opportunities, because sensors alone are cheap, and so you can have lots of them distributed around. You don't have to have a very expensive sound level meter with a data analyzer and a heavy battery and that on location. You can just have a lot of these small sensors scattered around with all the information going up to the cloud and the analysis being done subsequently. Next slide, please. So that means we can have a lot more information on area-wide noise levels. Cities can install noise sensors with other environmental sensors, and that can give extensive information on variation levels. They can be used for noise assessment. They can also be used for soundscape analysis. Now, soundscape is actually looking at the whole sound environment in certain areas, and this is an important area of study to to make sure that we're balancing the sound so that the sounds in different areas are not just not annoying, but are pleasant to the people who are in those areas. The other thing that you can do when you've got these sensors and sending information up to the cloud is to involve citizen science for reactions to the sound at the time. And you can even use mobile phones with limitations, because of course we know the microphone on the mobile phone may not be calibrated properly, but relatively we can still look at the data that might be coming from those. And there's quite a lot of studies being undertaken around the world. There's some various websites where you can plot in where you are and what the noise levels are and what your reaction to those noise levels are. Next slide, please. So this is just a graphic for a concept of a city array. You have all these sensors that are then sending information to a central base, and that allows the city council or the research or the university, if it's doing the research, or whatever organisation is assessing the information, to really keep a close watch and monitor the noise, and much more rapidly identify where there are spots with higher noise level, and then look at those and see what can be done to reduce those noises. Next slide, please. The EU has been sponsoring a number of such initiatives, and like for Santander Spain is one such initiative. They've got Internet of Things in the context of a smart city. They've got 740 sensors around. They include carbon monoxide sensors, light intensity, noise, temperature, car presence, plus mobile sensors on vehicles, etc. So they're really getting a heap of data about noise, the way the noise varies, the types of noise in different parts of the city. Next slide, please. There's another study in Pisa. These are just two examples. There are quite a lot of these studies around the European cities, and also in some of the Asian cities. They're developing these as well. This one is based on noise sensors located on private houses. So they've got the noise sensor. It's just a small sensor attached to the balcony, and the information is then being plotted to monitor the noise over time and season and activity. Next slide, please. Now, of course, these sorts of sensors and data has become very interesting to people working in acoustics, because of the change in the operation of a city before and after COVID restrictions. And I'm grateful here to two consultants who shared some charts that they had, where they had a noise logger on location before and then during the time of the restrictions. So in this one, the position was in an industrial area, but there was quite a lot of transportation around. And you can see the green line there is the noise level that would be typically be very low during the night time, then rise during the day. Then it dropped off the next evening and then rose not quite so high the second day. And that, so that represents 2 days worth of data. The blue line is in that same area of the city after the restrictions had been introduced, and the first line shows there's about a 5 to 6 dB reduction due to the reduction in the traffic flow in the area. On the second day, the reduction is again around about 5 to 6 dB, but then there was this little peak towards the late afternoon of the second day, and when the noise level was almost as loud as the pre-COVID time. And as I mentioned, this was in an industrial area, and it turned out that the nearby buildings were having, or factory industry that was there, was having a substantial amount of delivery activity at that time. So the noise, the local noise increased, even though the more global noise in the area was lower. Sometimes you will get these increases in local noise. Next slide, please. This one's a very hard one to understand, but this is again from another consultant who had a logger on site monitoring noise from a major roadway. The blue dots show a whole lot of noise level data over a number of days and a number of weeks. And the orange dots show the post-COVID ones. And you can see that the post-COVID ones again are reduced by about 5 to 6 dB. And that seems to be coming up quite broadly around the world. There's lots of people around the world who are doing this, and there's going to be a lot of publications investigating and reporting on and assessing the pre and post COVID restrictions, noise level data, and it'll provide a wealth of information for the environmental agencies when they're trying to establish reasonable and feasible compliance noise limits for various activities. Next slide, please. In terms of broad monitoring on a regular basis, the nearest that we've got in Australia is the Aircraft Noise and Flight Path Monitoring System, which is available to the general public to access. And this is WebTrack. You can access it from Air Services site. It has live with just a very short time lag, live data. It's well established. It's used for various forms of enforcement. It's also used for communication. So anybody, the important thing about this is that it's accessible to the whole community. You don't have to be in the airline industry. You don't have to be in Air Services to look at this. And I did do a comparative one. The chart that's a bit to the left, where you can see a lot of little blue planes and red planes entering and departing from Sydney Airport, was obviously pre-COVID. And the one on the right, I just did a download at 1600 on the 31st of August, and you can see there's only one plane in the area. The ones out around Blacktown are some helicopter operations in that area. But the little yellow dots are the noise monitors that are part of the monitoring system around the airport. And again, the numbers that are appearing there, of course, significantly less than the numbers that were appearing prior to the COVID restrictions. Next slide, please. With all of this monitoring and getting a lot of data, it's very tedious to try and identify exactly what's causing the spikes, the high noise levels. So automatic source identification is one of the goals. It's an important aspect because it's the only way that we're going to be able to dive into this big data. So when one noise is dominant, it's reasonably easy to define the rules. For example, the noise monitors around the airport. And you also got additional information about flight path tracking, so you can definitely identify that high noise levels rate because there was an aircraft within the area at that particular time. But when there are multiple noise sources or the target noise is very close to the ambient noise, it's a lot more challenging. Next slide, please. So feature extraction, our brains can do this almost instantaneously. We're really good at doing that, but it's really hard to do it. And there's a lot of work going on in this area to try and extract that information out of the broader noise. And the progress is generally going in parallel with auralization, which is making a sound from the model data, as well as computational auditory scene analysis. So this is something that's still a work in progress. It's not fully reliable at this stage, but it's certainly something that will be an outcome in the next couple of years. Next slide, please. So the basic requirement for establishing environmental noise goals is to achieve a low risk of health effects. The WHO studies and outcomes can be used as a guide, but we also need to consider what a community considers acceptable. The challenge is the reaction to environmental noise and annoyance varies very much across the community. Next slide. So we have to consider community response and what are the actual needs of the community. Demonstrate that annoyance is complex. It includes attitudes, visual, aesthetics, familiarity with the environment. Supported by complaint statistics is something else that feeds into community response. But you generally get somewhat of an inconsistent outcome because although the levels of individual aircraft have been reducing and the noise contours are moving close to the airport, the complaints should be reducing, but that's not happening. So you've got to offset that with the fact that the community is more aware of how to go about complaining about noise. So you're actually getting more complaints coming into the various organisations that are tracking that. Next slide, please. This really highlights the dose-response relationship, the variability across the community in that along the horizontal axis, we've got noise level, And on the vertical axis, we've got the percentage highly annoyed by that noise. And the different images there relate to, the different lines there relate to different types of noise sources. The blue one is the aircraft one. So people are very highly annoyed by noise from aircraft, as opposed to the same level of noise from road, and even less annoyed by the same level of noise from trains. So there's a subjective element, in a very strong subjective element in relation to dose-response relationships, and trying to use that as a measure or an indicator in the setting of compliance levels and establishing limits to noise. Next slide, please. So developing noise policy is not just noise level and character and knowing all your data and knowing what sort of noise you're dealing with. You've got to consider the broader aspects that have influence of perceptions of the community and understand the importance of clarity of information to the community. Next slide. And this chart here, I'm sorry, you probably may not be able to see the detail of it, but it's really highlighting the fact that it's like an onion. You've got annoyance in the centre, but you've got so many factors that are going to feed into that. The next circle around is the satisfaction, trust. Do you feel that it's fair? Do you feel that you've got some control? Is there somebody you can ring if you're really annoyed by the noise? And the next one around, the next shell of the onion is listening and communication, transparency. Do you know what's happening? Have you been told that there's going to be a noisy event happening and it's only going to go for a couple of hours? And that you've had the opportunity to have community forums and you've had real communication with organisations. So all of those aspects are very important in terms of the way people will react to the noise, how annoying they will find it. And also, you know, if they're not annoyed by it, they're less stressed by it, and we would like to think that they would not have such severe health effects consequently. Next slide, please. So sound and noise are part of society. We need to maintain sound in its most desirable form, the sound of music, the sound of nature, speech and hearing. We need to understand soundscapes. You know, what sort of sounds do we actually like to hear? We do know about hearing damage and beginning to know more about the health effects of noise, and technology provides for exciting opportunities for even greater understanding of noise. Next slide. And that then leads me on to the International Year of Sound 2020. It was an initiative of the International Commission for Acoustics to really highlight the importance of sound in so many aspects. I've been primarily focusing on environmental noise, but sound has a very important aspect in so many parts of our world, our scientific endeavours. You know, underwater sound, we've got atmospheric sound. It's used very, very widely, and so that was the goal of the Year of Sound. We managed to have the opening in Paris at the end of February, and then of course everything. And there were a huge number of activities planned for throughout the year to try and outreach activities to try and highlight the importance of sound throughout the year 2020. And of course then COVID hit, and so all of those activities that involved individuals meeting together were then stopped. However, the momentum for an International Year of Sound hasn't stopped. And if I can have the next slide, please. This just refers to the UNESCO resolution in 2017. So even UNESCO said that the sound environment is so important that it shapes our personal and collective behaviour. Next slide, please. So the goals of the International Year of Sound, as I've said, are to improve the public understanding, to highlight the importance and use and benefits of sound while controlling unwanted sound, to raise the understanding of those in society with hearing or speech impairment, and to promote the importance of protecting hearing. Next slide, please. So the International Year of Sound is now continuing into 2021. So it's going to be a 2-year celebration instead of a 1-year celebration. But a lot of that effort that went into planning for various outreach activities has actually been pivoted to now planning for and creating a lot of resources that will actually be a legacy of the Year of Sound 2020-2021. And I'm just highlighting the website there because the website has a lot of, you can see a lot of tabs, so it's got an event calendar. Unfortunately, a lot of those have been postponed to the next year. But it's also got a lot of information, a lot of resources. There's a video on the importance of sound, the sound in our world, that was sponsored by International Institute of Noise Control and Engineering. So it talks about different examples of noise control. There's a lot of other web information, technical information, etc., web links, etc. So, and downloadable information. That's all for free at this stage. So we, I do suggest that if anyone's interested in this, that you have a look at that website. And there's even some Australian ones, like there was a group that were measuring the sound of the rivers as an indication of environmental measures, and we're going to use that in conservation measures. And so they've shared their information on the sound that they measured all the way along. I think it was the Murray-Darling, I have to check that, but one of the rivers. So there's a lot of very interesting, innovative ideas and information that can be used by, can be accessed, and also some of it is actually educational, which can be used by people who'd like to supplement whatever information they already have. Next slide, please. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention, and I see we move over now to the Q&A.
Oh, Marion, that's fantastic. I'd like to thank you very much for a comprehensive discussion about noise issues. Let's move on to the Q&A, and then I can ask everyone to virtually be clapping and thanking Marion for her presentation at the end. But let's move to Q&A. And in fact, I have a question, but it actually feeds into this first question here, which is, how does the EPA see their role changing or not in the regulation and policy for road and rail noise? And will it change in relation to amendments to the EP Act? So Marion, I'm not sure whether you're aware, but in July 2021, we will have the new general environmental duty. And what that means is that all of us, and in particular duty holders, and that includes those who are, those who have cars and those who manage roadways and transport, will have an obligation to manage their emissions and discharges, etc., including noise, i.e. they must do what is reasonably practicable to ensure that the emission of noise, in this case, that they take that seriously and that they have done everything that they can. So in terms of our role, we provide advice into the road and rail sectors, as people would be aware, but under the general environmental duty, that the onus goes onto the duty holder to ensure they are doing the right thing. And I guess where my question was going to Marion after her presentation was, when you look at the new technologies and the new materials being developed, do you think that it's going to substantially change the noise in, say, the road and transport sectors? Or is that some way away? Like, how are we going in that space, and how long before we might see some significant improvements?
Well, certainly there are. I think it's not going to be a big step. What happens is that the new models of vehicles are made with the modern technology, and there's certainly been big improvements in a lot of the vehicles. On the other hand, with the trucks, of course, some of the very, very big trucks that we have in Australia, like the big DB doubles and that, have such powerful engines. You've got a real challenge there, but certainly the vehicles that travel around in the residential areas are, the potential is great there, and each model is a bit quieter than the last model. And people would know, if you go to buy a car, just a passenger car, the output noise from passenger cars is gradually reducing compared to what it was back in the 1990s, say. But the problem is that it takes a long time for this change to be implemented throughout the entire vehicle fleet. So it's going to be a bit more incremental. So in terms of the individual vehicles, then yes, the noise level for those is gradually reducing. The other factor is the tyre roadway interaction, and there are efforts there to have better and cleverer road surfaces, and so there are big improvements there. And in fact, there are predictions that into the future, the predominant noise will be the tyre roadway interaction and the aerodynamic noise around the vehicle, and both of those are manageable as well. So, you know, there is a lot of work going on in all of those areas to achieve this. Yes.
Interesting.
Nice.
So our next two questions are related to the health effects of noise, and I'm not sure whether you can answer this question. I can probably provide some answer, but it's in terms of how noise affects cardiovascular disease and how it affects metabolism and weight. And I'd also like to say that noise and air pollution go together, and air pollution has also been related to cardiovascular disease, which increases your risk of diabetes, etc. And of course, there are a range of concerns on that, but I wonder if you're able to elaborate a bit more about how noise causes these effects. We'll take these questions on notice and we'll provide a response later.
Well, probably be good to take it on notice and provide a bit more of a response, because I'm not a health expert by any means, but I believe that the linkage is really from the stress, the fact that the noise leads to annoyance, which leads to stress. And I think we all know that if we get stressed, even with a healthy heart, it'll start pumping away, so it has effects on your heart. So I believe that's the linkage across, and similarly that then continues on into the diabetes aspect, in that people, you know, as soon as you've got a stress on your body and you've got a potential for diabetes, you know, stress your body in one way and it'll show the effects in other parts of the body, is probably the best I could say.
And I actually listened to the International Society for Environmental Epidemiology was on last week, and I listened to some of their sessions on noise, and they've been actually looking at the combined effect on a range of health outcomes where they're considering air pollution and noise in joint models. And noise is still coming out on its own, affecting cardiovascular outcomes. So I will certainly get back to you with a better response than that. James?
If I can just add another comment too, of course, the effect of noise is often related to sleep disturbance as well. Sleep disturbance can then have, is just a different sort of stress. You're not awake and considering that you're annoyed by the noise, but you are suddenly wakened, so you don't get the sleep, and so all of that has an effect on your body.
So the next question is about wind turbines causing impact on health, not just annoyance, as shown in your graph at the low dB levels. I wonder if you wanted to make a comment on that.
Again, this is something that's a very topical issue. It's an area where there have been a lot of claims about other types of health effects from wind turbine noise. I believe that there are a number of studies, and in fact there's a very, very recent study, so I think it would be better to take that one on notice, because up until recently there's been, my understanding is that there's very little strong evidence of that relationship at the very low frequency. There's a concern about low frequency noise effects that are right down in the very, very low frequencies, and maybe that's what that question is relating to. But we can refer back to, there's been a study in Australia which there is a report, and I can refer them back to that report.
Yeah, I was going to make a comment. The National Health and Medical Research Council have put out some advice on that, and they do cite a study which is essentially saying there's no consistent no consistency in the studies in terms of the effects on health, but that they need much more robust study designs to actually answer the question. So if my reading of the NHMRC outcomes and their expert panel is right, that's essentially what they're saying.
Thank you, Andrea. That was what I had in the back of my mind, but I'm really pleased that you're endorsing that. And can I just add that one of the reasons why there's needed to have more investigation is that it comes back to the demographics, the number of people you need a large cohort of people who are exposed to the same sort of noise or the same sort of low frequency sound or whatever it may be, in order to be able to then link it across and definitively show that you've got health effects showing up.
So this is a nice question that I probably shouldn't answer because I'm biased because I come from Victoria. So Marion, how does Victorian regulation of noise, and you can be honest, compare with other states or countries? Who's doing it well and what can we do better?
I'm really pleased with that question because I haven't.
It's a good question.
Haven't looked recently. There's some years ago we did a review of the different states, and really the outcome of the different policies across the states. The outcome at that time, when I say some years ago, it was over a decade ago. The outcome really was that they were all about the same in terms of their noise policy. The goal, even though the numbers and the metrics were a little bit different, the actual goals were much of a muchness, and there wasn't a huge difference between any of them. But I know that the states have been modifying and updating and improving their policies since that study was done. And thank you for raising that, because I think it would be interesting to do it again now in 2020. And this would be a very good time to do a review of the noise policy around Australia and just really check it. One of the challenges, and I can remember when we did the previous one, was that it takes a little while to do any of these studies and to write it all up, and we were just about writing it up, and then bang, there's another policy. A different state, is introducing a slightly different policy in this area. So it was you had to sort of set a date and say, well, we're not going to look at anything after this date.
So we do have some new regulations coming in place, and as I said, the general environmental duty, which is quite a different focus because it puts the onus on the duty holder to manage their own noise. So it's going to be interesting in any comparison, I think.
Yes.
So in terms of this question, occasional noise is not very disturbing compared with motorway noise, and the noise barriers don't seem to have evolved much in Australia. Do we know if there's much progress in that field? It's a good question.
Yes, there's quite a bit of progress in the field of traffic noise barriers, mainly in trying to apply new clever techniques to, on the one hand, to minimise the profile of the barriers, and on the other hand to try and have the effective height of the barrier greater than the physical height of the barrier. What I mean there is, if you can do clever things on the top of the barrier, you can get a reduction in noise which would normally be achieved by a higher barrier. So you keep the barrier a bit lower, but you do clever things on the top to have the waves offsetting each other, etc. And you can try and have sound absorbing material at the higher sections of the barriers as well to avoid bounce back between the barriers. But yes, there are improvements there, but to be honest, I don't think there's going to be a very dramatic change in the near future. It's a matter of improving and giving and optimising the barriers, really. That's what it comes down to.
So the next question is what your thoughts are on including background ambient noise measurements in setting noise limits. Despite it being slightly more complex, Tim is interested in your views on whether it's more robust for setting appropriate limits, particularly for industry. And I guess what he's getting at is that cumulative noise aspect in terms of setting limits that you take. I mean, I'm more used to air sheds, but let's call it a noise shed for argument's sake, or an acoustic environment. Yeah.
Yes. Well, I mean, some of the legislation around the country and policy around the country does do this. It compares the noise level from the offending noise with whatever is the background noise in the area and uses that as a measure, as opposed to a planning approach. The challenge with using a background noise, as the questioner Tim has raised, is that you have to measure twice. You have to measure the background noise when the offending noise is not there. Then you have to measure when the offending noise is there, and you can't just go and measure it like at 2 o'clock on a Monday, because you have to actually average it out. The noise, even during the daytime, or the noise in the evening, or the noise at the night time, is going to vary. So you need to make a reasonable estimation of what that background noise level is in different time zones. So it does become a bit more complicated, and particularly in industrial environments where you might have a number of other noisy activities that of themselves are sitting there in the background, but they're actually raising the background a little bit. And then you measure the background with them operating before the new person comes in. You know, it makes it a little bit difficult to see whether there is fairness in that situation. On the other hand, if you have it based on a land use method where you say the noise level for this area should not exceed this value, this is a reasonable value for this area, you always have a bit of a challenge on the boundaries between the two different zones. So if you've got residential next to a commercial, you have to have special treatments for the people that are right on that periphery boundary. So both methods have their challenges. Whether one's better than the other, it really, you know, I wouldn't really like to make a preference for one or the other.
Okay, thanks for that. And Namiko has asked, what's the difference between acoustic black holes and noise cancellation?
Okay, noise cancellation is when you actually create a noise that's 180 degrees out of phase with the noise that you're dealing with. It's quite difficult to do it with a broadband noise. It's much more effective if you've got a lower frequency sound. So as soon as when you've got lower frequencies, you've got longer wavelengths, so it's more feasible to get this matching, 180 degree out of phase matching, so that the resultant is almost zero. It's never zero, but at the higher frequencies, it's very hard to get this matching because the wavelength is only tiny. So in a noise cancelling application, you're creating a noise to offset the existing noise that's in the area. In the black hole, the acoustic black hole, you're trying to create it's related to the structure-borne sound. So you're trying to make sure that the vibration that's set up in a structure kind of disappears down a hole and doesn't radiate sound. So it's quite a different approach.
Okay, thank you. John's made an observation about the correlation between the length of time a noise source has been around and its acceptance or tolerance. And he's referring to the graph that showed train noise is most accepted, then car noise, then aircraft, and finally wind turbine noise. And he thinks that mirrors when those sounds were introduced to society, and whether you had any comment on that.
Well, indeed, I think there is a relationship there. There's also, but it's not just a simple one in terms of when they were introduced. There are those other factors that we talked about. Train noise is a very interesting one in that trains can be quite loud, and certainly if there are problems in rural areas with freight trains because the surrounding area is very quiet. Freight trains are coal trains, and that they're carrying large amounts of coal. They've got quite big engines. They're going for long periods of time. But in residential areas, the issue of trains is it's very reliable. It's predictable because they go to a train timetable. The length of each passing train is very similar. Whereas for road traffic noise, you don't know whether you're going to get a platoon of noisy cars or trucks or whatever. So there's a lot more variability. So all of these factors blend into it. So there's a lot of the psychology associated with the reaction to the sound in terms of the way people will consider it to be an unacceptable or an acceptable noise. So I think, sorry to answer that. So it was a long answer, but I don't think it's only time. I think he is right. Yes, that is one of the many factors that go into it.
Okay, and there's a question here. What do you think are the primary obstacles to reducing noise levels in the environment currently? Given we know we have these relationships with, you know, health and environmental outcomes, what are some of the obstacles?
Well, I guess it depends upon where do you start first. You know, I think we're already doing a lot in this respect, in that we're already we're already my husband just brought in a chocolate biscuit for me. I was fading. We're already making inroads into reduction of noise in each one of them. So I don't think that there's a primary obstacle. if I look at it more globally, rather than thinking about noise source by noise source, if I look at it more globally, I think probably the enforcement is probably one of the critical things that's very important, and that's one of the important roles of the EPA, is not just to establish policy and establish compliance limits or noise levels or whatever, but also to make sure that these are being implemented in a reasonable and a fair way. The worst thing is to set the limits so low that industry and commerce can't, and recreation can't be in place. So I think that the EPA has a very challenging role in trying to set these reasonable levels, but the enforcement is probably just equally as important.
Look, I think that's a terrific place to actually finish this session. I have learnt so much about noise. I kind of knew some things about it, but I'm particularly interested in the black holes and some of that new technology. And I think the other thing that we're doing here in Victoria, we're actually doing some research which has been stymied by COVID-19 in developing a noise map for Melbourne. And so we did have some work going on where we were going out and doing some additional noise monitoring that's put on hold at the moment, but we're hoping to develop one of those noise maps which will also help us and aid in decision making and working out where priority areas might be for attention. But Marion, I know everyone listening will be thanking you greatly. Hopefully they're all clapping you as I am right now, as we would in a normal setting. It's been most valuable. Thank you very much for your time. And I think perhaps we'll have to have another of these sessions, given that we'll have the Year of Acoustics going into 2021, or sound going into 2021. Maybe it's a time to continue it for Australia as well. And thank you to everyone listening today for spending time listening to this particular topic. Our next environmental seminar series is actually coming up in October, so please keep an eye out for that. And wish you all well. And for those of you in Victoria under stage 4 restrictions, stay safe and stay strong. And we'll see you next time. Thank you.